Have we turned eating into a near-death experience? That's a good start for the morning. Having just had breakfast a short while ago, what'd you choose to eat? And what motivated your choice? Did you take a walk first so you could splurge on a muffin? Or are you a grain or cereal person only? Or, as I lobbied for breakfast, having hard-boiled eggs? Eating sustains us, but are we making the right choice? And what is the science? And what are the behavioral patterns that dictate what we eat? It's a subject to which we bring a lot of our own prejudice, and it's a science whose norms are changing. What was an absolute science, or what was necessary for good health 10 years ago, has changed dramatically. We're fortunate to have our two speakers here this morning to discuss the ever-changing topic of eating habits and the science around how and what we eat affects our bodies and our mental state. Our own David McCarron, who has spent a great deal of his professional life studying the issue of blood pressure, lipid disorders, and diabetes control and the science of nutrition. After Williams, University of Pennsylvania Med School, residency at Case Western Reserve, and a year in Haiti, where he said he had his best experience in medical training. He subsequently received a nephrology fellowship at Tufts New England Medical School as chief resident. And it was during that time that he had a case in which he observed might link high blood pressure with severe calcium disorder. This observation set the focus for much of his academic career. In 1977, he moved to Portland, Oregon, where he remains today. During his faculty position there in Oregon Health and Science University, his lab was responsible for guiding medicine's largest multi-centered outpatient trials of comprehensive diet improvement for blood pressure, lipid disorders, and diabetes control. And he conducted the longest animal experiment in NASA's history on the shuttle Columbia, which documented the critical importance of maintaining calcium balance for cardiovascular function during a long space flight. In 2004, he was awarded the International Prize for Modern Nutrition. And since retiring from Oregon Health and Science University in 2001, he's been the visiting professor in the nutrition department at UC Davis, where much of his time has been spent on US nutritional policy. For 7 years, he directed from the Office of the Surgeon General and the American Academy of Pediatrics a community-based effort on childhood obesity. More recently, he's been working with both the private sector and Congress to evaluate the country's nutritional guidelines. In recognition of that work, he was elected to the board of American Society of Nutrition. Over the past 40 years, he's published over 200 peer-reviewed articles and lectured on the research in over 20 countries. That's pretty impressive. Our other speaker is an assistant professor here at Williams, Jeremy Cohen. And he is a PhD from Cornell University and is now an assistant professor in psychology at the department here in the psychology department here at Williams. Jeremy related to me his current research aims to explore how non-conscious process function, including their role in developing first impressions of others, as well as an attitude formation and social judgment. One example of this kind of question that interests him is, after you've developed an impression of someone, what kind of things could you learn about them that can instantly change your automatic and unintentional responses toward them? His work has been published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Advances in Experimental Social Psychology, Emotion, and several others. His research has also been reported in the New York Times, Quartz, Scientific America, and The Conversation. At Williams, he teaches a course in social psychology and social judgment. During winter study in 2017, he taught a course on the psychology of eating, which explored how behavioral science, especially social psychology and social judgment literatures, can inform our understanding of why we eat things we do and how our food-related decisions can be powerfully influenced by an overwhelming number of factors, only one of which is hunger. I'm pleased to announce and to bring to this discussion David McCarron and Jeremy Cohen.
I want to thank the class for providing this opportunity. Jeremy, as a psychologist, understanding first impressions of people, I don't know why he decided to join me. This is a very personal topic. Aside from sex and a few other things, what you eat is something that's very personal. People care about it. So I think there will be some response to these thoughts. This slide, which some of you saw in a handout, this is not where you want your wife to be in 20 years. As I said to Huff last night, if all of us sort of listen to some of these things, there's a chance we'll have a 75th reunion. And the question to Eddie Wing is, what's this molecule, Eddie? Yes. And do you remember what Hodge Markgraf said to us at first day of organic chemistry? Because it's got something powerful to say about our nutrition policy. Hodge said, as he danced around drawing this on the board, we're going to study this molecule for the whole semester because every hormone that makes you function is based upon cholesterol. And every cell membrane is built on cholesterol. Why would you ever tell people to not eat cholesterol? And then there's this view of the world. He had it right. Another scientist. This commentary that appeared about 18 months ago, and I didn't pick the title and I didn't pick the picture because Sylvia Burwell, I thought, might sue me. They were done by the editors, and I wrote my editor at the Wall Street Journal when I opened it on that Friday night, and I said, do you have a witness protection program? This I was asked to write by the Journal because of the idea that the new guidelines were going to come out in a few months. And much of what I'm going to say right now is based upon what was in that article. So we have dietary guidelines that were first written by an unemployed journalist from the Providence Journal. He was not a scientist. And it was a very conscious decision to move forward with this document from the McGovern committee that was on starvation. You can read the comments. As I said in the Wall Street Journal, the only one that was right was Pete Ahrens, who said, we're going to carry out an experiment in the US population as though they were Sprague-Dawley rats. And that's exactly what we've done. Without going through these, you can recognize that the original guidelines said, drop your cholesterol, don't eat fats, avoid eggs, avoid full-fat dairy, eat carbs instead of fats, emphasize vegetable oils filled with trans fats, reduce your salt. Peanuts weren't in there, but that's a compelling story that just surfaced this year and is a sobering reminder of how little we still know. And then you look at where we are today. And the most interesting one is a study out of the University of Connecticut a few months ago where they fed 1 egg a day for 6 weeks, 2 eggs a day for 6 weeks, and 3 eggs a day to middle-aged subjects. 1 was good, 2 was better, 3 was best. I'm just going to talk about 2 of the issues, but they overlap in terms of how they affected the other guidelines. The whole cholesterol recommendation would never have happened if this study had been published. This is a Minnesota coronary experiment. It was a large study done by the father of the fat hypothesis, Ansel Keys. It was carried out in the mid-60s to the early 70s, and is this the pointer? Well, you can see, you don't want to be in the blue line. They fed a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet to thousands of people, and the other ones got the typical American diet. That's a survival curve. You want to be in the red line. the data was never published. The American Heart knew about it. National Institutes of Health knew about the data. It was never published. Until a year and a half ago, scientists from Carolina dragged it out of the basement of the grandson of Ansel Keys, who, right after the trial was finished, retired to Italy, where he lived very well for 35 more years. I guess that's one way of handling data that you don't want to share. Because he had already been telling people that fat and cholesterol killed you, and yet his own study said it didn't. And then the salt issue. This is one of the giants of hypertension research. It must be, because he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. But this graph over there is a classic graph, and what he showed was, as you dropped your sodium intake, which is the x-axis, a hormone that is known to be a potent vasoconstrictor, something you wouldn't want to stimulate, went up. This is a classic slide that's taught to certainly nephrologists, if not other doctors. And he also reported in the New England Journal, this was the lead article in 1972, that the people who were on the low salt diets and had a history of heart failure were dying faster than the people who were eating a normal salt diet. And yet at that time, and still today, most people with heart failure are told to reduce their salt intake. Now, I'm setting you up. So Time magazine in '82 published this graph. And I had the opportunity to meet with Art Hayes, the commissioner, a year or two later, because of some data that I was about to publish in the journal Science. And Art said, I understand your data, but this is not about science. This is about politics. That's exactly what was said to me in the commissioner's office. So I'm not new to this discussion. And I only discovered this a year ago when somebody told me to Google Phil Boffey's name. Phil Boffey just retired from the editorial board at the time in 1982 where he quoted me. He was a young science writer for the New York Times. And when I found it, I thought, thank God they wrote that down, because the only thing wrong with my statement is I was off by about 15 years. Sandy Miller was in the room with me when Art Hayes said it was about politics and not science. Roughly 12 years later, he was quoted in the journal Science that if there was any scientific issue that demonstrated how political science is in this country, it was the salt controversy. And the work had already been done in 1936 to answer this question. This gentleman was an immigrant, came to Johns Hopkins, was a physiologist interested in behavior, and was ultimately responsible for setting the stage for understanding appetite in humans and animals. And the way he got started is tragic. The story's in the literature. A 6 or 7-year-old boy was admitted to the medical wards at Hopkins, and the nurses recognized that he had this voracious salt appetite, eating everything he could find that had salt. And the nurses were concerned, so they asked the dietitians to put him on a low-salt diet. 4 days later, he died. He was found to have a hormone deficiency that didn't allow him to conserve what other scientists have called sodium chloride is more the blood of life than blood itself, a few years ago in the New England Journal. And he took this lesson from this one boy and developed a body of work for which he was recognized by the National Academy of Sciences that described appetite behavior. And why is this important? Well, if there's one thing you can take away today, you need to appreciate the brain is controlling much of what you eat, particularly essential nutrients, of which there's a long list. There's more nerve innervation between your gut and your brain than any other organ. I don't know if Marty's here and wants to argue with me about that, but, and it's because the gut is informing the brain, and the brain knows what you need, and you don't realize where it's guiding you, but it does ultimately determine day to day, week to week, whether you're getting an adequate amount. And all our nutrients follow some type of Gaussian distribution. And where you don't want to be is at the low end. Because as soon as you drift towards the low end, you begin to develop a disease state. Different, depending upon whatever the nutrient is. And this has worked. There's 2 studies here. The one up the side is work funded by the Gates Foundation. The blue pattern area is work that we did at Davis. Both of them published. There's about 600,000 people on the slide. Doesn't matter where you look in the world. Doesn't matter what your food supply is or your culinary tendencies. When you measure urinary sodium, which is the best thing we have, and is pretty precise for a population, it's the same number. Whether you're in Belgium, whether you're in Tokyo, Beijing, or in Williamstown. It varies a little bit day to day, but the brain is keeping it within this range. And as I've written, this is physiology. And public policy can't trump physiology. You're going to eat. But the government keeps saying Americans are eating too much salt. That's a number that's been arbitrarily established. And in spite of this data, this is enough urine to cover New Jersey in about a foot, okay? Which is probably a good thing for New Jersey. I'm sorry for that. The important thing is whether it's the Gates work or ours, the average is very consistent. Those are all within the same number. It's about 3,000 to 3,600 or 3,800 milligrams per day. And it doesn't change. You may eat a little more one day, a little less another, but over 4 or 5 days, it's the same number. And we knew what the number was from Dr. Lehrer work in 1972. Because if you took that graph that was with the Time magazine, and this is getting very mathematical, well beyond me, but if you look at where the asymptote intersects the standard deviation, it would predict what the human intake should be. We reported 160 millimoles per day, milliequivalents. That graph predicts 156. So Dr. Lehrer's work actually back in 1972 had identified what our intake should be. And when you look at our work and you graph it out by quintiles, it's almost a perfect Gaussian distribution. And why is that important? Well, what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's a very contentious situation right now, the government does not, the American Heart does not, the FDA does not want to accept this data. There are about 33 trials, now it's all observational data, where there are urine sodiums, and they know what happened to them, mortality. The green area is what we've described and others as the normal range, and you can see adverse outcomes are flat. And if you go to high levels, you do have adverse outcomes. You have heart attacks, strokes. It doesn't matter whether you have heart failure, diabetes, and it says in the red, or the pink and the red, are where our dietary guidelines, American Heart Guidelines are. And believe me, you don't want to be on that upslope. But that's the range that they currently have in the dietary guidelines. Multiple studies have demonstrated this in the last 6 years. And here's the most frightening part. Many of the studies have shown that it's the healthiest amongst us who are most likely to have an adverse outcome from a low sodium intake. This is a slide right out of the New England Journal. I'm sorry, it's complex, but if you just look across, because the experts keep saying this is reverse causality, that these people are sick and they're eating a low sodium diet. Well, the folks from McMaster's, and they have another study in Lancet last year, collectively it's about 240,000 people from around the world. The worst probability is sitting amongst the healthiest people. And we don't understand why that is, but there's a good chance it's actually related to low sodium diets affecting your serum sodium, which then sets you up for potential cardiac events. I shared Gina Collada's article, who is the senior science writer now at the New York Times. Her headline is right. If you read the article, There's two major things that this article said, and this was just published 4 weeks ago. And the scientists interviewed by Gina got it right. This has so much in here that we never even thought we knew about sodium chloride. We all know if you have a high salt diet, you drink more. Well, the answer is no, you don't. And the other key finding was the more salt you had in your diet, the more efficient you were burning calories. So think of what the combination is of a low sodium food with the same amount of calories. These are good research questions, but pay attention. So I just offer up these 4 headlines. They're about eggs, they're about dairy foods, they're about saturated fats. All these studies are just coming out left and right now, showing that everything we were told, not only are 3 eggs better, but a full-fat dairy food has better health benefits. I go to the store yesterday, got a couple yogurts, and they're all 0 fat. There are studies in the literature now that show, while yogurt's good, a full-fat yogurt is healthier. It's going to take decades to change this way of thinking in this country. So we have a lot of adverse outcomes here. There's general agreement that the eat carbs, don't eat fat was a major contributor to our obesity and diabetes. Our life expectancy is now dropping. It hasn't dropped very much, but that's because it's like a washout curve in a kidney. It starts decreasing years before you actually pick it up, and we're now beginning to pick it up. A lot of essential nutrients we're not eating. We have young kids in this country with rates of rickets that we haven't seen in 100 years. We now have iodine deficiency. Young families are not eating the highest quality protein. It's the cheapest, where they have to spend their dollars carefully. That includes peanut butter. And we pushed a lot of empty calories. We all know that. I hope to make your day a little better. I wouldn't take it too far. A dear friend of mine, actually the senior author on that sodium paper that Gina Clotter wrote about, said to me, you know, David, we need a 2-word guideline: eat less. But if you're going to eat less, eat this way. Now, this is the tricky part. I got to find the mouse. Jeremy, get up here. All right. Okay.
Well, he's fully recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast, he requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charmed substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy, precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible.
We should have had Woody Allen write the dietary guidelines. So I'm going to end with examples. These are 4 people. Had we gone out and talked to the crowds, the wisdom of crowds, they would have told you what to eat. This woman, as you can see, was in the obituaries. She was 114, good, clean living and a daily milkshake. And you'll see certain things run through this. This is a woman that died 8 years ago. Obama visited her a couple days before, and who knows what happened to her primary care. But steady diet, crispy bacon, fried chicken, and ice cream. The thinnest people in America eat the most ice cream. That's an NIH study that they've never talked about. And then there's this lady you may have heard about, died just 4 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. 3 eggs a day. 2 uncooked in the morning and 1 fried at lunch. And as you can see, her smart doctors kept telling her she was going to kill herself. And then there's Fred Kummerow, who's a world-renowned scientist who in 1958 in a science paper warned the country about trans fats, and it was ignored. And this is obituaries from last Friday in the New York Times. 102, red meat, whole milk, eggs scrambled in butter. And then we can turn to our politicians. Some of them have some great ideas. Mike Huckabee. My motto is that if it comes through the car window, it isn't food. If what you eat creates a greasy sack, eat the sack. Throw the food out, at least the sack has fiber. Or, entering Alzheimer's, the president said only raccoon, when he was asked how he's doing with Nancy, this is true, how are you doing with Nancy's low cholesterol, low fat, or low sodium diet? And his answer was, only a raccoon can eat an egg without salt. He wasn't doing too well. So we always have to be reminded, this is a famous historian wrote a wonderful 3-volume book about science in the 70s. You see this quote a lot of medical schools and other places, and it's what's happened here. We have to, if you set policy, it's going to change, because any policy should be built on facts, and the facts are going to change. Or you can be a motorcycle repairman, and you come at it from the other view. Ignorance is a powerful tool, if applied at the right time, even usually surpassing knowledge. Or John Adams. I've sent this to the White House. I haven't had a response. Facts are stubborn things, whatever may be your wishes or inclinations or dictates our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
So thanks so much for having me here. When David invited me to be part of this panel, I was very excited because, so as you heard, I'm trained as a behavioral scientist and study social judgment and decision making. And I think that there are a lot of very productive conversations that can take place between medicine and biology and behavioral science in ways that are not fully appreciated at this point. And so what I'd like to do today is to talk about what I see as one of those kinds of connections and ways in which behavioral science can inform not just our understanding of how to change or how to shape food decision making, but also how we perceive and understand food science and how we make sense of that. And the first observation that I want to make is just that these are not facts that we just passively accept and take into account when trying to motivate or understand what we should consume. These kinds of pieces of information that we learn about the sort of latest trend out there in terms of whether a food is or ingredient is harmful or helpful to us have a stake. We have a very large stake in the outcome of the results of those science, because after all, I could learn that the smoothie that I've been drinking for the last 5 years every morning that I thought was helpful because of its fruit content could very well be harmful because of its sugar content, and so on, ad nauseum. We could learn all kinds of facts about behaviors that we engage in that turn out to be non-optimal for our health. And so we're not passive observers or in considering this kind of information. We have a stake in the outcome, and we have conclusions that we want to reach. And that is an idea that is very prominent in the behavioral science literature, applied not just to food, but to all kinds of threats that we face. And so what I'd like to do today is to flesh out some of those mechanisms and how having a stake in the outcome can change the way that we perceive the evidence and how we understand it and whether we believe it and whether it ultimately leads us to change our behaviors. So I want to suggest to you that all of us in this room have what we might think of as a kind of psychological immune system. And that immune system functions very similarly to the physiological immune system, in that its task is to protect us. Instead of protecting us from bacteria and foreign invaders, the psychological immune system is a series of cognitive tools that we have in our toolkit that allow us to be protected from threats to the self. So I want to suggest to you that all of us in this room have a series of basic motivations, of beliefs that we would like to hold about the self. All of us in this room want to be right. We want to be correct. We want to come to conclusions that are valid. All of us in this room at the same time want to be liked. We want to be invited to social events and to be accepted by others. And I'd also like to suggest to you that one of our basic motivations is that we want to be healthy. We want to be productive. We want to engage in behaviors that are optimal so that we can live a long life. Now, in situations, of course, where we face evidence that suggests that we are not right, or that we are not liked, or that we are not healthy, the psychological immune system swoops into action and uses this series of cognitive tools to help ameliorate the impact of that information, to help us to maintain a positive view of the self, to come to the conclusion that we are valuable and healthy and productive and efficacious individuals, even in the face of affronts to that particular conclusion or viewpoint. Now, the thing that's really interesting about the psychological immune system is that you can't just make stuff up. You can't just believe something about yourself simply because you want to. We want to believe that we're right and liked and healthy, but of course, as you know, you encounter evidence sometimes where that's not true. And in those kinds of situations, our beliefs cannot be wholly self-deluded. You have to come to an assessment of yourself that is grounded in some ways in reality. And so you have to do what Ziva Kunda called achieve a kind of illusion of objectivity. The goal isn't to be objective. That's not our purpose. Our goal instead is to look like we are objective, to come to conclusions that seem as though they are unbiased and objective, but that in fact lead us more often than not to the conclusions that we want to hold. And so what I want to show you are a series of ways in which we achieve this kind of illusion of objectivity. Now, this idea might seem familiar to you because that's essentially the job of a really good lawyer, right? The job of a lawyer is not to come to an objective understanding of the situation. The job of a lawyer is to reach a preferred conclusion, to come to the most congenial interpretation of a situation as possible. That, of course, is grounded in the facts, but that spins those facts or interprets them in a way that allows a particular conclusion to be reached. And so I want to suggest to you that all of us have a kind of intuitive lawyer in all of us that attempts to take information about the self and make the best case that we can for it. And while we do that, we want to appear to be intuitive scientists. We want to seem as though we are being objective while we do it. And so I'll show you a series of techniques that the intuitive lawyer uses in order to be able to reach these kinds of conclusions while appearing to be unbiased and objective. Okay, so the first fact that, the first sort of element of the evidence gathering process is to acquire information. So we encounter an outcome. We experience a particular event that's related to our health. The first thing that we need to do is to figure out what it means and to try to recruit evidence or information that might suggest particular conclusions and make those more plausible, and to make other conclusions less plausible. So Williams has this wellness incentive sort of benefit package in which if you engage in a series of very simple behaviors that lead you to acquire information about your health status, you get a few bucks added to your paycheck. And so one of those facts is, or one of those behaviors that you can engage in is you can get a physical and get some preventative blood work and get a whole series of health indicators. And then another one is that you can fill out one of these health assessments where you provide some information about your health-related behaviors. And then at the end of it, you get a score, which tells you whether you're doing anything that, on the basis of this questionnaire, suggests maybe dangerous or life-threatening. And so let's suppose that you fail that. You don't do nearly as well as you might think. Some indicators on your blood work aren't looking too good. You have some high cholesterol, blood glucose is higher than you might want, and your behavioral indicators are suggesting that you're engaging in behaviors that might not be particularly conducive to a healthy lifestyle. Now the question is, what do you do with this information? Now, of course, if you're an intuitive scientist, the first thing that you would do is you would try to come to an objective understanding about how that occurred so that you could try to make changes in the future to your behavior. But of course, we're not intuitive scientists, we're intuitive lawyers, and there are certain conclusions that we want to come to about the causes of this particular failure. So if you think about the information that you might gather, the explanations that you might have, you might see that, for example, as being caused by genetics. You may have high cholesterol because your parents had high cholesterol. But it could also be, even less troublingly, it could also be because of a false positive. Maybe the blood work was, there was a failure in the test, and you don't actually have high cholesterol. Or it could be that you engage in a series of behaviors that are indeed problematic. It could be because you were sedentary, or it could be because you eat butter instead of margarine. Or it could be because of that steak that you have every Sunday night, or bacon and eggs every morning. Whatever it might be, there are a whole series of ways in which we might try to consult our memories. None of those are true. Whatever it might be, you might try to recruit evidence or consult your memory about your behaviors to try to come to an understanding of how you got this result. But notice that there are some conclusions that I would really want to reach. And there are some conclusions that I really wouldn't. I actually really like that steak. I really would not like it to be related to my red meat consumption. I would love it if it was a false positive and that I'm actually healthy, and so on. And so what we can do is we can think about how the intuitive lawyer can bias this evidence gathering process. How does that influence the way that we attempt to acquire information about the explanation for why we experience a negative outcome? And one really easy way that the intuitive lawyer can bias this process is by deciding when to stop recruiting evidence. So if you recruit a bunch of evidence, and it turns out that the case is looking pretty good for a conclusion that you would want to draw, you stop. You're done. But if it turns out that the evidence suggests that you're doing something problematic, in those kinds of cases, you really start to dig in. You try to find evidence that casts doubt on that particular conclusion. You try to find other evidence that suggests that the test result may be unreliable, and so on. And so the intuitive lawyer can stick his or her hands in this process to influence how much evidence we demand for a particular finding. So Dan Gilbert, in his usually pithy way, he's a very famous social psychologist at Harvard. He says, when our bathroom scale delivers bad news, we hop off and then on again, just to make sure we didn't misread the display or put too much pressure on one foot. When the scale delivers good news, we smile and we head for the shower. By uncritically accepting evidence when it pleases us and insisting on more when it doesn't, we subtly tip the scales in our favor. See what he did there. And so the idea, of course, is that we can demand a different level or amount of evidence depending on whether the conclusion is favorable or unfavorable. Here's a really classic study that demonstrates this point. So you're brought into the lab and you're told about a condition called thioamine acylase deficiency, TAA deficiency. So you're told in a brief monologue by the experimenter that TAA is an enzyme that exists in your body, just like lactase. And this enzyme, just like lactase, can sometimes become deficient in some individuals. Now, of course, with lactase, if you develop a deficiency, that makes you lactose intolerant. If you have TAA deficiency, it puts you at risk for pancreatic cancer. So you really don't want that. Now, of course, there's no such thing as TAA deficiency, but the point of this monologue is to communicate one simple fact, which is that you do not want TAA deficiency. This is something that you really want to avoid in terms of a health outcome. Now, happily, it turns out that science has come to the rescue, and there's a very simple test that you can conduct that will allow you to determine whether you have TAA deficiency or not. And that's with a very simple litmus test. So it's a chemically soaked piece of paper that you spit into a cup, you put the litmus strip into the cup of your saliva, And then on the basis of random assignment, participants are told either that the strip will change color if you have TAA deficiency, or it will not change color if you have TAA deficiency. And so what the researchers have done here is they've constructed a scenario in which the groups of participants want different outcomes. One of the groups wants the strip to change, the other group doesn't. Now, the second lie of the study is that the chemically soaked paper is missing the chemically soaked part. It's just paper. So it will never change color. And now the question is, how much evidence do you demand when you receive a result that is inconsistent with your favored conclusion of being healthy versus consistent with that conclusion? So notice that if you are an intuitive scientist, there's a very simple technique that you should use, which is that you should conduct the test and you should decide when it's complete solely on the basis of the information that's available to you. But the intuitive lawyer can stick his or her hands in this process very easily. If you don't want the strip to change color, then what you do is you dip it in the saliva, you say, didn't change color, seems like that's great, put it in the envelope, and you're done. In the other case, however, you can wait longer. You can wait for the strip to change and be unwilling to accept a particular negative outcome. Well, maybe it'll take a bit longer to work. Maybe this is a slow-moving chemical process. Or you might test multiple strips. You might say, well, maybe that strip was defective. Maybe I better try another one. Let's spit in another cup and make sure that it works. And so what the researchers are trying to understand is those two behaviors. How long does it take you to accept the conclusion, to take the limit strip, put it in the envelope, and seal it to indicate that you accept the result? And how often do you engage in multiple tests? How often do you retry the test? And what you can see here is that when participants are motivated to see the strip change color, if we look at the amount of time that they spend on the decision, it takes them about 100 seconds or so before they're willing to accept it. Now, these are people, of course, who really want to see the strip change, and so they're unwilling to accept that conclusion. And as a result, they take quite a long time to finalize their result. What about the people who are motivated to not see the strip change color? These are people who got the result that they wanted early in the process, and of course, they accept that much more early in the process as well. This gap right here, that's the intuitive lawyer in action. We are engaging in different subtle behaviors that change the way that we evaluate the evidence and ultimately change the way that we accept or do not accept a particular result. And additionally, if we look also at the number of people who try to test the strip more than once, as a measure of a sort of seeking out a second opinion, we see that it's very likely to occur if you wanted the strip to change and it didn't, and it's not at all likely to occur if you wanted the strip to not change and it didn't. And so this is an example in which information exposure can very dramatically change how we, or the conclusions that we want to come to can change how we expose ourselves to evidence or not. Now, of course, there's a very easy way that you could bias this process of evidence gathering. Wouldn't it be really valuable if everything that came to mind for you was evidence to suggest the particular conclusion that you wanted to draw? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you never encountered evidence that was inconsistent with the views that you wanted to hold? And what I'd like to suggest to you is that this process of evidence gathering can be biased long before we ever encounter a particular threatening outcome in the health domain. We can sort of cocoon ourselves within a particular set of pieces of evidence or pieces of information that bias the way the evidence comes to mind for us. This is an idea I'll call selective exposure. So this is the faculty lounge over in the biology building. And we helpfully, just behind this here is a coffee maker. So it's a place where faculty very often congregate while they're making their morning cup of coffee. And helpfully on the other side of the wall, we have some news articles that have been printed. And those articles are about how wonderful it is to drink coffee for your health. Now, noticeably absent here are all of the studies that show that caffeine is a terrible thing for your health. But that's okay, because that would be a real bummer if you walked into the coffee lounge and got exposure to evidence to suggest that that was a bad idea. But notice that what that does is it biases the information that you have available to you. When you ask yourself, how important is it, or that I reduce my caffeine consumption, I say it's not that important. It looks like it might be healthy. But we forget that we've missed a whole series of pieces of evidence that could challenge that view. This is a really interesting study, actually, from last month that shows that we're actually willing to incur costs in order to avoid exposure to viewpoints that we disagree with. This was a study that was done with things like political positions, like support or opposition to abortion. And what they do is they invite participants into the lab and they say, we'll give you some money. You have an opportunity to win some cash. Now, if you choose to read the viewpoint that agrees with your opinion, you have an opportunity to win $7. But if you agree to read the thing that is inconsistent with your viewpoint, you can win 10. Now, of course, it seems really easy. You can get extra money if you get exposure to this other viewpoint, and it's equally easy as a task. But in fact, it turns out that 2/3 of subjects are willing to forego the money in order to be exposed to views that are consistent with their own. And so if we think about our exposure to something like caffeine, or our decision about whether we should be changing our caffeine consumption, notice that now the evidence that's available to me is biased in a systematic sort of way. Now, what about once we've already encountered the evidence? So you read a piece in the New York Times that suggests that some particular food is either helpful or harmful to us. Now, of course, your status about whether you consume that food or not will change the way that you evaluate that evidence. And there are a number of pieces of evidence in behavioral science that suggest that this process can be biased based on the conclusions that we want to come to. So I'll just show you one of those very quickly. The idea is very simple, which is that if we think about the standards that we hold evidence to for preferred and unpreferred conclusions, we hold them to very different standards. When we ask about a favorable proposition, the question that we ask ourselves is it possible for me to believe this? Can I believe this? Is it possible for me to accept this conclusion? When we encounter something unfavorable, however, we ask ourselves, must I believe this? Is it a requirement? And that different standard can change the way that we evaluate the evidence. Here's a very quick study that shows that point. So it's a study that, in which participants are brought into the lab and are told about a connection, a purported connection between caffeine consumption and fibrocystic disease. Now, the participants are told that fibrocystic disease leads to lumps in the breasts of women, and this is completely unaffected. It completely has no effect on men. And so the idea is very simple. We need exactly two things to be true to learn that caffeine and fibrocystic disease are related. You need to be a woman, and you need to be a coffee drinker. And so the other three conditions, male coffee drinkers, male non-coffee drinkers, and female non-coffee drinkers, are all natural controls. So you read this evidence, and then we ask you a very simple question. What do you think about it? Do you think it's a good study, or do you think it's a bad study? And if you look at what their assessments of the quality of the study, first of all, there's no effect if you're male, whether you're a coffee drinker or not. You think it's a reasonably good study. Nor do you think it's a bad study if you're a female non-coffee drinker. If you don't consume caffeine, it's not threatening information. But of course, if you're a female coffee drinker, now suddenly it's a bad study. It's a worse study in terms of its quality. The female coffee drinkers are asking themselves, must I believe this? Not can I? I'm going to skip that one in light of time. So if we think back now to the question of how we perceive or think about evidence out there in the literature as we encounter it, that is not a passive process. It is something that leads us to bias the way that we gather evidence and the way we evaluate that evidence in ways that can subtly tip the scales in the favor of conclusions that we want to reach. So I can't necessarily tell you how much salt you should consume, but I can suggest to you that the amount that you think is appropriate is in some ways related to the amount of salt that you already eat in your diet. So thank you very much.
As an intuitive lawyer, and having spent my life doing that, I'm going to now put butter back on my lobster. But I'd like to ask for questions, and we have a few minutes to answer. Ed.
I would just suggest the same intuitive lawyer is very active in the laboratories of our scientists. That scientists have the same sorts of biases that was shown, even in very hard science, that the same processes are operating.
Yeah, so what I would suggest is that
I'm sorry, the question was, that, can you stand up and give that again, Ed? I think
Say everything again.
I just, I think you would say it much better than I would, and with more credibility.
Careful, Ed.
The same intuitive lawyer is operative in our intuitive scientists in the laboratories, even in the hard sciences. Scientists have biases, they have previous work, they have their NIH grants to get, and they have the same sort of biases in their work. And it's actually been shown in our
Double blind experiment.
Yeah.
Right, and so what I would suggest two things. So the first thing that I would suggest is that that's absolutely the case. I'm suggesting that absolutely every single one of us in this room is an intuitive lawyer, and not just in the health domain, in all kinds of domains where we have a preferred conclusion that we would want to reach. It's just a natural feature of how we evaluate evidence and how we attempt to interpret it, and the conclusions that we draw from it as a result. But the other thing that I would say, as was already pointed out, is that science is designed in ways essentially to try to eliminate and tie the hands down of the intuitive lawyer, in ways that try to make those conclusions more objective. And in fact, this is actually something that is a very, very large-scale issue in social psychology right now, thinking about ways in which we can prevent what we call researcher degrees of freedom, from preventing flexibility in analyses that can lead to conclusions that we want to draw from data, or that can invalidate some of the ideas that we have that we draw from the results of our studies. And so it's very much worth it to think about how these processes operate in the context of science, including food science and nutrition science, but also to think about the ways in which we can prevent that process from unfolding. And so, well, an idea that I didn't fully communicate is that the place where the intuitive lawyer really operates is when results are ambiguous. When you can come to conclusions that you want to come to, or that it can be interpreted in multiple ways. And one of the things that we try to do in science is to prevent that kind of flexibility or ambiguity. So there's a movement right now in social psychology especially, but really more all of behavioral science, to pre-register hypotheses, to pre-commit to strategies for data analysis and sample sizes and so on, in ways that prevent us from being able to exploit that ambiguity.
So Ed's point is absolutely correct, and it explains a lot of what's happened in nutritional sciences, but it affects medicine across the board. And one of the ways we deal with this is to do a randomized trial. In the area of nutrition, it's probably the most difficult human study to do, because it's tough to do a double-blind trial. You know what you're eating. There are ways, in the case of sodium, to do it. The establishment has repeatedly refused to fund a randomized trial. One would argue there's some bias there. But that is, I think, soon to have happen in this country, and you may read about it. And that will reduce some of this bias by doing that.
Over here.
I'm Rob Goldstein. I'm a long-time endocrinologist, and I have a couple of comments for Dr. McCarron. I thank you for your lovely presentation, and some of the observational data you presented are compelling and interesting. I will say that in terms of the cholesterol, this is a very, very, in my view, controversial area, and depending on who you are, the cholesterol hypothesis has tremendous validity, in particular as validated by recent data published with PCSK9 inhibitors, these this new injectable anti-cholesterol agent that remarkably lowers LDL. Anyway, there's data coming out that the lower the cholesterol, the lower your LDL cholesterol, the better off you are in terms of coronary plaque and coronary events. So, I mean, this is a very, I'm not disputing any of the nice data Dr. McCarron presented, but there's a lot more to this story, and I wouldn't blithely going around eating tons of saturated fat. From a trans fat point of view, unquestionably, that's a bad actor. And also, as Dr. McCarron pointed out, the over-restriction of fat and the excess intake of refined carbs has led to the metabolic syndrome, has led to the epidemic of obesity and insulin resistance and prediabetes and overt diabetes that's overwhelming the medical resources of this country.
Rob, is that do you have a question in what we're saying here? That's all. I just wanted for the panel, because we can talk about this outside afterwards too. But I just
they actually
I'd like to have
brought
a
bacon
question.
and eggs for the.
Yeah. Why don't you save that for outside? Just simply because we want to have questions here. The panel. Yes, in the back.
Len Kirsch, class 57. Don't confuse me with facts I've already made up my mind. Red wine. There's so much articles about how good red wine is and how bad alcohol is. So my question to you, doctor, is should I replace my orange juice in the morning with a good Malbec?
A good question.
I think they call that a loaded question. And I would suggest that you wait until at least noon.
Ted.
David, you implied that it's data from the government, federal government, or whatever, is unreliable and can't be trusted and constantly changing. So my question is, who benefits from improper information from the federal government? Or said another way, what are the root causes of this inadequacy of the federal government to provide good information? Is it special interest groups? Is it lack of agility for evolving sound science? I don't understand quite what the context is.
Well, you know, you've asked one of the most common questions that I get asked by both lay people and it's a challenge to explain it, but I think there's multiple possibilities. On the hand of government long-term bureaucrats, they've already put a stake in the ground, and they automatically don't want to walk away from that stake. It takes a lot to do that. Here are a few facts. The National High Cholesterol Education Program, which informed Americans about the dangers of cholesterol, were all funded by the drug industry. If you look at these subjects at Connecticut that ate 1 egg, 2 eggs, or 3, it looks like they took 1 statin, 2 statins, or 3 statins. The question now is, if we had been eating the cholesterol, would, you know, the tens of millions of people, many of you in this room that are taking a statin, would be on a statin, or would you be eating an egg? I don't know, but that's a relevant question. So there's a bias on the commercial side. And unfortunately, the government evaluates its own science. I would say that's the biggest problem. And it's one that haunts all kinds of policy in this country. The national academies are funded by the government. That's who analyzes our scientific data. They have a problem. Their funder is the government. And we have to try to get to, and I don't have an answer, a system that independently evaluates data. In the area of medicine, one of the better examples that's had a good track record is the Cochrane collaboration, mainly out of the Scandinavian countries, but Canada, and there's a couple good centers here. They're the ones who raised the question, are mammograms always necessary? And the answer is not as often as we were telling women. They're the ones who said, you know, those PSAs, there's some problems there, and maybe you don't have to have them all done. They're more independent, but I'm sure they have their problems too. We need to figure this out though, Ted, because it leads us, one of the things that, and I'll just finish by saying, one of the aspects of science is you get an unusual finding, and that's really what you want to have in a laboratory. you don't want to validate what your hypothesis was. You're going to learn when you get something that's different. Science demands multiple studies that are different. That's what crashes through the barrier. And there's a famous medical scientist just died that Peter and I had at Penn, Peter Noel, and he described the Philadelphia chromosome. He was just hatcheted in science in 1976 when he said cancer therapy would someday be individualized, which is, of course, where we're headed. Peter used to say, we made the boxes, biology didn't. And I think we need to think about it. You have to get out of the box, and it's tough. And you have to do a lot of experiments, and eventually you break through.
I think that's really it in terms of time for questions. Jeremy and David will be out in the hall afterwards, and I'd like to thank you both for really a great presentation this morning.